welcome everyone. I see a few of our attendees are still coming in. My name is Austin Brown, for those who don't know me already. I direct our Policy Institute at UC Davis, and I'm also affiliated faculty as an adjunct faculty member with the Transportation Technology and Policy program. But it's my very great privilege today to introduce our seminar speaker, Vicki Arroyo. Vicki is the executive director of the Georgetown Climate Center, based at Georgetown University Law Center, and she's also a professor of practice there. You'll hear much more from her, but in this role, she's done really extraordinary things for policy in the Northeast on clean transportation and energy through some really innovative collaborative mechanisms that I think are really, if not unique, then incredibly distinctive and leading in terms of how we'll see regional and local collaboration around addressing and fighting climate change. She also recently completed her service as chair of the executive committee of the Transportation Research Board. For those in the program who don't yet know of TRB, you will. It's the biggest gathering, the annual meeting is the biggest gathering of transportation researchers. Last year, it brought over 13,000 transportation researchers to DC in January, and we'll see how that translates to online, but I'm sure it'll be a big and successful again this year. And it's really the main coordination between the transportation research community in the United States. So we really appreciate her leadership in that capacity as well. And then she's a member of the UC Davis ITS Board of Advisors in all of her spare time. We don't know where she finds it, but she's done really an extraordinary amount of service to help UC Davis improve our research and our contributions to the policy environment. So personally, I've always been inspired by Vicki's leadership in this area, and I'm really pleased and privileged to introduce her to you all and to listen to her talk about transforming transportation, a topic that she and I seem to nerd out on more and more these days. So please join me in welcoming Vicki Arroyo.
Thank you so much, Austin. It's my pleasure to be here. I think so much of your work, and I'm just really honored to have the opportunity to speak to our friends at UC Davis. You all just do such leading work on this issue, and really grateful for so many ways that we partner, including on a report that I'll end my talk today on that we launched this week together. But I just want to, get through some slides, and hopefully my internet will be fine. Natalie's going to help me move through these slides, and if my internet connection is unstable, I might just have to close down my video, but hopefully you can hear me fine. And I started with thinking about the topic with the team at UC Davis on transforming transportation. And you always need a subtitle after a colon, right? So accelerating the transition to cleaner, more resilient, and a more equitable future. These are all things that we work on at the Georgetown Climate Center, largely with states, but to some extent at the state and local level and the nexus of state and local policy. And because we're based here in the Washington, DC area, at the federal level as well, when we have a willing administration and opportunities in Congress to work on this. So the next slide says a little bit more about our center, and I'll wait for that to advance. We were launched a little bit over 10 years ago now as a resource to the states. We have an office at the Hall of States, which is a building right there by the Capitol and Union Station, if you're familiar with DC. And we work at the nexus of state and federal policies. We have supported states through research, through facilitation, and through convenings like the ones you see in these pictures with senior state agency officials, sometimes meeting with stakeholders, including private sector, NGOs, other academics, and other thought leadership. The picture at the bottom is actually back when Gina McCarthy was at EPA, and we were facilitating a series of roundtable conversations with the regulated community, with states, with NGOs and think tanks, and with the leadership of EPA around the Clean Power Plan. And the top pictures you see people like Secretary of Environment in Maryland, Ben Grumbles, and Kelly Speaks Bachman, who was one of the people who helped found TCI and is now leading the Battery Storage Association. So anyway, I've had opportunities to work with really some amazing people in our 10 years or more now. Next slide, please. I think many of you are aware that the climate change is happening. Climate change is happening. We're seeing these anomalies in temperature. From this slide, you can see that we are dramatically getting warmer. So the anomalies are all in the direction of getting warmer. The last 5 years were the warmest on record. In fact, 2019 was the warmest in recorded history, and we might be on track to beat that in 2020. The next slide, please, shows some of the impacts of transportation emissions and the other emissions that are contributing to climate change. Transportation, of course, being now the largest sector, certainly in our region, I think in the US, in part because some of the actions that the states are taking or that the government has taken in general to shift to more renewable power in the electricity sector and from coal to natural gas, some of the market changes that we've seen, that really hasn't happened so much yet in the transportation sector, and it's something that we all work on. The emissions, of course, are contributing to the climate change impacts that you're experiencing on the West Coast with fires and bad air quality. My family has been affected by hurricanes, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And of course, we're seeing these impacts worldwide. Next slide. So Zeta was just this week, and in fact, it also just came through here yesterday in Virginia. It made its way really quickly, but it was actually one of the largest storms to hit New Orleans directly in many, many years. Even Katrina didn't hit New Orleans directly. It's knocked out power to over 2 million people. And I know a lot of my family members in Louisiana and in southern Mississippi are still affected by having their power and their internet out, which of course could be life-threatening for people, on oxygen, or people who start experience, if we have a heat wave that follows it. Fortunately, it brought some cooler weather, but often people die from the extremes after these storms, even if you don't die directly from the impact of the storm, which fortunately there weren't any fatalities that I'm aware of in New Orleans from that storm. But the city was hit hard and they're really digging out. Next slide, please. Of course, the storm that people think of with New Orleans is Katrina. And that also was, of course, quite devastating, even though it wasn't a direct hit. The levees broke and it flooded 80% of the city, including my family's homes. That was my mom's home at the top in the Gentilly area, which is a, as you can see, sort of a modest middle class part of the city with very racially mixed and, elderly people that mostly made up the population, and some young families as well, of course. So the two pictures at the top were her house inside and out, and that car wasn't hers. She was legally blind and couldn't drive, but it was carried by floodwaters that were all the way up to the roof. And the house below is my sister's house, and she was near another levee that breached. So her house and her husband's were destroyed. Next slide, please. So this shows you the kind of damage on the inside, before and after shots of her home. And she and her husband and my mom and a friend who also lost his home in Gentilly came and lived with me after these. And so I've sort of, been able to experience what people are going through with the disruptions from impacts that are certainly made worse in an era of climate change, even if not caused directly by climate change. And we're seeing more of these kind of extreme weather events that really are very disruptive and often causing people to have to migrate and move. In the case of my family, for 6 months to a year before they moved back to the general area, but in some cases permanently. Next slide. So as I mentioned, transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gas pollution in the US. And of course, it's not just greenhouse gas pollution that we're worried about. It's also conventional air pollution that causes a lot of health effects. Next slide. And the impacts of transportation pollution are very significant. And the next slide actually, I think, goes into even more detail about that. My early part of my career, and I'm happy to talk about this more with students in Q&A, was at EPA, where I worked on toxic air pollution reductions in Louisiana, as well in the state government where I worked. I went back home and worked, which I encourage you all to think about doing wherever home is, and worked in 2 offices of EPA, the Air and Radiation Office and the Office of Research Development, on conventional air quality standards, because so many people die from the exposures to air pollution, even not talking about the greenhouse gas emissions effects. Next slide. So here are some of the public health impacts of transportation pollution, including the ozone that's created in the atmosphere from the emissions from the vehicles, NOx and others, PM 2.5. You see the range of impacts, including cardiopulmonary impacts that could even lead to premature death. And as we've seen in COVID, the exposure to things like air pollution was essentially like a pre-existing condition. And we have seen disparate impacts, especially in communities of color, where Black and brown people have died, and people living near highways, for example, at a higher rate than other people, in part due to maybe other aspects of systemic racism and the built environment, food deserts, lack of accessible or affordable healthcare. But air pollution has also been linked by Harvard, which actually did this study as well earlier, with what we're seeing in terms of the increased mortality from COVID. Next slide. So what are we doing about it? Well, as many of you know, in the last administration, in the Obama years, in the very first term, they started tackling the greenhouse gas regulations using the Clean Air Act, a tried and true statute that has been around for about 50 years now. And they have done a couple of rounds of those standards, culminating in work with California to harmonize the federal standards and the California leading standards that many, many other states follow. And that would have led to tremendous gains in the miles per gallon, so fuel economy, saved consumers at the pump, certainly saved emissions, as you see here from these charts. Next slide. But of course, like the Clean Power Plan, which I discussed a bit earlier, and the role that our center played, that standard was rolled back by this administration when Trump came in, and the vehicle standards of the last administration have also been rolled back. And California's waiver authority to go beyond those federal limits has also been challenged. And of course, this is being litigated right now. Next slide. So in spite of that, the states and cities, which is generally what our center has been set up to work with, have been exploring options to reduce emissions from transportation and give people access to transit alternatives, transit, biking, pedestrian, safe, complete streets, for example, make it easier for people to switch to an electric vehicle and have charging infrastructure in their neighborhoods. These kinds of amenities that are interesting to the states and cities and their constituents for a variety of reasons, including the climate impacts, but often because they just want these amenities for their own benefit in their communities. So we've been working to foster how states and local communities can actually achieve more of these benefits, even without a really willing federal partner at the moment in the White House. Next slide. And for some time now, even before the change in the federal administration, we have been asked by states about 10 years ago to start facilitating a dialogue among the states in this region, from the mid-Atlantic up through New England, to talk about how they might work together to reduce emissions from the transportation sector through something called the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which we facilitate. And so you see one of the meetings that we've had over the years, that one happened to be in New York, and the original memorandum of intent that the states signed on to work together to share best practices and to work together to reduce emissions and to create a new clean energy economy and transportation system in this part of the country. Next slide. So the TCI was launched with 12 Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states and the District of Columbia. This was the NASTA region. So for the students who really are transportation wonks, you might know that the country is broken up into region, and there's like a trade association, if you will, serving the transportation agencies in certain parts of the country. And so this is the region that we started with, because that group already knew each other. The states' energy and environmental agencies actually knew each other from a cap and invest program that has been working for some time to reduce the emissions from air pollution from power plants, but they reached out to their transportation agency friends, and we started meetings around these NASTO events over the years, and it's grown into a quite large collaboration that has involved a lot of outreach and a lot of research that I'll tell you about in the slides coming up. The top slide there shows me with some of the DOT secretaries at the 5th year anniversary of TCI. And you see Bruce Ho in the left bottom from NRDC speaking at a big public event that we had in 2019, and Deputy Secretary of Transportation in Maryland, Earl Lewis, who's the vice chair of TCI on the right. Next slide. So I mentioned that transportation is the largest sector. And in this region, it's also growing. Of course, now we're in this COVID period where nothing is normal, but generally transportation emissions were continuing to grow really unabated, even as we really have been getting more and more of a handle, thankfully, in part because of RGGI, in part because of the market shifts that we talked about, also state renewable portfolio standards and other things. that have been driving those reductions in the electricity sector, including efficiency investments, weatherization programs, and things like that. There were things that were invested in part with the benefits from RGGI, from the proceeds of RGGI, just like in California, where those proceeds from AB 32 and the trading program there have gone to try to reduce the carbon footprint in the state. Next slide. And many of these states, when we started TCI, had economy-wide ambitious greenhouse gas reduction goals on the books. You see them here. They generally went to 2080, and they were a pretty steep decline. That was going to be hard to achieve given the increase in emissions from the transportation sector. Many of these states now have even more ambitious net zero kind of targets that they would like to achieve. And so it's even more important that we try to collaborate and reduce transportation emissions in order for them to make those reductions. Next slide. So I mentioned that we started at TCI in 2010, and the first years of the program, we worked at the state's pleasure on a variety of things that they were interested in, including how to promote clean vehicles, electric vehicles, for example, like the Bolt that I drive, how to provide for more charging corridors to allow people to travel from state to state and not have range anxiety. We did some analysis with support of an early DOE grant that looked at some of the obstacles to charging, whether it be for people who might not have a garage that they could charge in, or how do you comply with ADA, or if you're a vendor or a company that provides charging at your site, do you get regulated as a utility? So really teasing out some of the barriers, and these were some interesting areas of research that we did early on that we really just didn't have easy answers to in these early days of deploying electric vehicles and charging infrastructure. We also worked with Rutgers University to do research on sustainable communities practices and to share what people were doing to try to get people out of their cars and to reduce VMT as much as possible. We also looked at freight flows with Rochester Institute of Technology to see whether or not we could actually reduce carbon footprint in the region by shifting to lower carbon alternatives. And we even beat back a patent troll who was going after the states and the local governments who were sharing real-time information on their bus and transit and subway arrival schedules, saying that they have the patents to that and people couldn't share that information. So we did a lot of good work, but the states really wanted to do something that was really more tangible, a benefit of working regionally. And so for the last several years, we've also been working on a cap and invest program for this sector. Next slide. Oh, sorry, before I go on, I forgot I added this just today. There is a lot of work on our website. I know many of you do research, and I know Austin does really leading research on these things. Please do check out our site. We do have a tool that shows where people can charge and where there might be some gaps so that states can use it to fill some of those gaps on the EV charging networks in the region. And there's been some reports that Matthew Getz, who's worked with me in Austin and Dan on other projects, has done, including on the question about utilities and their role. And we're working on signage to be consistent and a variety of other things. And you can look that up on our website or our TCI's website. Next slide. So because the states had really wanted to take advantage of the scale of an opportunity here with a region with 72 million people, over 5 trillion in GDP, more registered vehicles than I think even California has, and many more emissions that are coming from RGGI. It's actually 3 times the cap of RGGI if we were going to actually try to cover this region somehow with some kind of a system. And seeing the really dramatic numbers for the transportation emissions in that pie, they wanted to really take on this as a regional challenge, if you will. And so some years ago, we started looking and doing some analysis and research with Cambridge Systematics of what approaches might work. We talked to your colleagues in California. We talked to people looking at VMT approaches, pay-as-you-drive kind of approaches. We talked to folks in British Columbia, and the states were, hearing from colleagues who were regulating in these other places about what approaches might work. And then we opened the dialogue to very public processes starting in 2017 with 2 large workshops in Washington, D.C. and in New York City around Climate Week, and then a series of public events in 2018. So we can go to the next slide, please, Natalie. So one of the challenges that comes up with transportation that we certainly hear a lot about in TCI is that transportation raises equity concerns because people who are disproportionately impacted by the impacts of transportation are often those who live in communities that have often experienced lack of investment, racial segregation, redlining, and things that make them more exposed to both the impacts of climate change, but also to pollution. For example, when the highway system was created, there's a lot of history there that some of you might be scholars of that show that these communities were generally the ones that were targeted for that investment of the infrastructure for the national highway system that bifurcated neighborhoods and really has brought pollution and other issues to those communities and broken up some of the kind of connectivity in those communities. So looking at PM 2.5 numbers, you could see that there's a correlation around where that exposure to those either facilities like ports or bus terminals or even the highways and roadways are with pollution, of course. Next slide. And the closer you live to a major road or highway, as you can see in this chart, that was done, I think this was an earlier Harvard assessment, and this has been also held up more recently in Union of Concerned Scientists work. But those emissions are, of course, concentrated for the people who are closest to highways and roadways. And again, often those are people who are not affluent, and that's why these neighborhoods are bifurcated by these highways and roadways. Next slide. And that air pollution tends to be concentrated in communities of color. So Latino and African American and other people of color have 30 to 40% greater exposure to some of this particulate matter and other pollution from motor vehicles. Next slide. And of course, the impacts of climate change, as we're seeing around the world and certainly in our own country, you might remember the pictures from Katrina, disproportionately affect often low-income communities and specifically communities of color. Again, because to some extent, this is by design because of the policies in our country, like redlining, like housing that has not been fair, like the lack of investment in green space, places for the water to flow safely and for people to move around safely. So we've seen that in disaster after disaster. And so both from a conventional air pollution side and a climate impact side, we're seeing that disproportionate impact. So it's important that we keep in mind the equity considerations around the topic of transportation emissions and also transportation resilience. Next slide. So the states engaged in 2017, as I mentioned, in 2 large workshops, and then much more intentionally through very public calls that generated a lot of interest. 500 people came, many more than that obviously were invited for that kind of turnout. 100 state agency reps worked with our center to facilitate these roundtable discussions that you see here, where the public weighed in on what transportation needs and opportunities they saw in their communities, what their goals were for a future low carbon transportation system that would bring amenities to their region that they cared about into their communities, and how different types of policies might help achieve those goals. And I should say that not only did we do a series of 6 regional listening sessions, which are written up in a report that's on the TCI website if you're interested, but the states also did extensive outreach in this period of time to their own communities. Next slide. And so this culminated in 2018 in an announcement that a subset of TCI states would be working to design regional low carbon transportation policies that would use a cap and reduction of emissions model. This is my words, not theirs. For this California audience, California has this experience, right, with capping the emissions from the transportation sector. So similarly, it would allow each TCI jurisdiction to invest the proceeds into low carbon and more resilient transportation infrastructure. So this was a statement of a subset of the TCI states that they would be working together in 2018. And then we proceeded in 2019 to have yet more public process that's covered on some of the next slides. So in 2019, those states, but honestly, all the states in the region, whether they signed on to that statement or not, engaged with the public in 3 large regional workshops in the before times when people could get together, but also where people could participate by live stream, and we had interpreters as well. participation of 1,000 people, over 1,200 submissions to a public portal where people could put in their comment, and again, more community engagement at the individual state level in many states as well. Next slide. So that informed a draft memorandum of understanding that was released by TCI jurisdictions in December of last year, and that laid out the program goals, an ambitious schedule that included an MOU that would have been final before now if it weren't for COVID, the elements of a model rule, investments in equity, a regional organization that would be stood up to do this, program monitoring and review. It invited public input to a portal that we have up still to this day, with the final MOU originally scheduled for the spring and now scheduled for the fall because of COVID. Next slide. So the features of a regional cap and invest program are these. Unlike, for example, a carbon tax, which is another market mechanism, it does provide an actual cap on the emissions. It would allow for then regional consistency of allowance prices, as folks would have to hold allowances under that cap, but they could trade those allowances. This would be an upstream cap with allowance trading that would be available. It does offer, though, the flexibility and compliance. And as we've seen from RGGI and the California experience and the EU, these programs, if designed correctly, can drive innovation and investments in low carbon transportation programs. So we expect, and the modeling suggests, that the impacts of a policy like this are driven less by what will likely be a modest price signal upstream, but will be very much affected by the investments that are made with input from the community. Next slide. The policy could raise significant proceeds to fund a lot of things that we've heard over the years, the public ones, including some of these things that you're seeing here, bike share programs, but also the just, safe, bikeable, walkable streets, as we're seeing the importance of that right now. Investment in transit, which has also been hit hard by COVID. That's really important to keep transit available and affordable for people. Shifting transit to electric buses and other buses, buying down the cost of the investment in early buses, and looking at port electrification and other ways to reduce conventional pollution as well as greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide. So we've done a lot of modeling, working with various firms, including Cambridge Systematics and On Location and Resources for the Future, and more recently, Harvard School of Public Health and other academic institutions around TCI. And some of this was announced at a mid-September workshop that's on the web if you want more detail, but it shows some of the modeling scenarios for reducing emissions by 20, 22, and 25%, and what proceeds would be generated from that policy. That could generate much more, for example, than the kind of proceeds that have been used in the VW settlement to buy down the cost of electric buses and other investments that actually help move the needle in transportation, anywhere from $1 billion to over $5 billion, depending on how strict the cap is set, which is still something under consideration. Next slide. The conclusions from the modeling is that the program will have a positive impact on the economy. The GDP, income, and jobs are projected to be greater than BAU from business as usual, and create positive benefits, certainly health benefits, which I'll get into more in a minute. There has been, or there could be, significant progress towards achieving climate goals by reducing pollution at modest cost and with net economic benefits to the tune of what you see here. Next slide. Again, there's whole PowerPoint presentations on our website if you want to go into a deeper dive, but just to give you in a more accessible format, the idea behind some of the modeling looked at investment scenarios, so you could see the kinds of investments that could be made depending, again, on how you set the cap and what that might drive in terms of the money that goes to electrifying light trucks and vans and vehicles, and buying down the cost of those vehicles for people, looking at getting people into used electric vehicles, for example, investing in transit, investing in complete streets and safer alternatives to single occupancy vehicles, system efficiency. The design of TCI originally was stated by the states to, like with the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, allow the states to determine with their stakeholders what those transportation investments would look like. But this year, given everyone's concern about equity and the highlight on equity, we've been having even more engagement around equity and hearing from stakeholders that they wanted more of a tangible commitment at the regional level, that a significant amount of those proceeds would go for the communities that are most affected, either overburdened by pollution or underserved by transportation alternatives. And so the TCI jurisdictions recently announced that they intend to invest proceeds of 35% at least in their states, working with EJ groups that they bring to the table in a transparent manner, with annual reporting on the progress from this and from complementary policies that they're undertaking. So this is a new commitment coming out this year that we expect to be folded into the MOU that's coming out later this year. I will say they're still taking comments, so that could change, but I know they don't intend to make that any weaker. So a minimum of 35% allowances, which is quite significant, in the hundreds of millions to over $1 billion. Next slide. And these are some of the earlier estimated benefits from the program before some of these specific commitments were made, according to some of the analysis that we have done with our modelers. More recently, a team at Harvard School of Public Health has gone even more in depth and tried to look at what the implications might be at the community level. And I think I share some bullet points from the Harvard School of Public Health analysis on the next slide. So I know this is pretty wordy, but I didn't want to cut it and get anything wrong. The point being here that Harvard School of Public Health worked with BU and folks from North Carolina and other experts to estimate the health benefits from this policy. There has been concerns, as you know, in California about cap and trade programs and whether or not they create hotspots. So we wanted Harvard to look at this. They did this independent. This was not a study that came through Georgetown. They did find that the TCI policy scenarios, and this was before that dedicated 35% of the funding, could prevent up to 1,000 premature deaths and nearly 5,000 childhood asthma cases annually, and that health benefits occur in every single county across the region, and that the largest air quality impacts due to transportation pollution, of course, would occur in those areas that are more disproportionately affected by that pollution now. So everyone would benefit, and those communities, of course, would benefit more. Not to say that all the pollution would go away from a policy like this, but that this pollution would be reduced through a policy like this. And they also found benefits not just from air quality, but a lot of health benefits, and this might be interesting to some of you who research active transportation. A lot of the health benefits were associated with the increase in physical activity from biking and walking from physical activity, which of course shows how important it is to make sure that that is accessible and safe to everyone in all neighborhoods throughout the region. Next slide. So this public engagement process, as you can see, has been very robust. We've also been doing a lot of modeling and analysis that I just gave you the tip of the iceberg on. The states themselves have been working in work groups for years now together and really forging bonds and directing this analysis and directing my staff to support them in this important work. Next slide. And we continue to hear from people, stakeholders of all stripes, businesses, through meetings. Virtually now, we've gone online, like everyone has had to go in this COVID era, but hundreds and hundreds of people have been showing up to the webinars that we've been holding, and the portal remains open for public comment, which we continue to take. Next slide. I mentioned that the response has been quite robust. We've had now more than these, because this is a little bit dated, over 4,000 submissions, but actually when you look at the individuals who have sometimes signed letters jointly or organizations, it's actually over 10,000 different individuals and organizations, a wide variety of stakeholders, from the people that might be regulated who do not like a program, from the people who might be regulated who now support climate action and are supporting this program, from NGOs that want this program to go further, from equity groups that are concerned about the issues that they're concerned about related to cap and invest programs historically, and or this one in particular. So a very, very wide variety of people have been weighing in and continue to do so. Next slide. These are just a couple of the letters that we've received to the portal, and it shows some of the diversity of some of the folks that we have heard from, including oil companies like BP, trade associations, associations of folks who work with more of an environmental banner, and some of the equity voices that have been weighing in. Next slide. And there has been some outreach to the press in the form of op-eds that some of these folks that are trying to, weigh in one way or another on the process have been doing. Some of the mainstream press that has covered TCI in this region. And of course, there's social media and more happening as we speak, probably. Next slide. So I wanted to also talk about the impacts of climate change, because we're already seeing these impacts in our communities. And another anniversary, a sad anniversary this week in October, was Sandy, which of course affected many people in this region where I'm speaking, because of course Sandy was a huge storm and affected people all the way from Florida who had disaster declarations as well, all the way up through New York and New Jersey, which were hit very hard, in Connecticut, New England. Damage of over 63 billion. And you see here the taxi fleet in New York, and others that were affected, including many in the transportation sector in all modes. Next slide. So this is another impact in New Jersey, outside of Atlantic City, on the approach to Atlantic City. You see the kind of devastating damage that can be done, very expensive damage that can be done for the roadways. So, some of your researchers who might be more in the engineering program might be learning about how to develop roads and bridges that can withstand the kind of impacts that we're seeing through modeling projections, because the past can't be a predictor of what we've got to build towards in terms of standards now. So roads might be built in a more resilient way, including elevating roadways, making them otherwise more robust to stand up to the kind of weather extremes that we're seeing, whether it could be heat or flooding or other extremes that we're seeing in the era of climate change. Next slide. And there have been projects, including some that we've been involved in at Georgetown Climate Center and our adaptation team with Rebuild by Design, to look at innovative ways to build differently, considering climate change impacts. And some of these were, of course, supported by the last administration, and these are just a couple out of New Jersey, post-Sandy. Federal Highway Administration, in coordination with the states of New Jersey and New York and Connecticut, supported work on how to make the transportation infrastructure in the region, which of course has so many people, more resilient, so you wouldn't be knocked out economically for months at a time. Pilot projects, including this one here that you see there on the right, was a climate vulnerability assessment that actually started even before Sandy. And I was on the first Gulf Coast climate adaptation work that started years ago before Katrina. So people have been thinking about how to make our transportation infrastructure more resilient. But a lot of this work has been more at the climate vulnerability assessment phase, or maybe the planning phase, as opposed to really investing differently for the most part. But there are some examples and case studies. Next slide. And of course, the transit systems, if you recall, in New York, the water was just pouring into some of the subways. Certainly that affected New Jersey as well. The electrical systems were affected in the subways, and grant programs that the last administration gave through FTA to foster resilience, and reports like the ones that you see on the screen were aimed at having the transportation and the transit infrastructure rebuilt in a way that would be more resilient in the future to power outages that might come from a storm. Next slide. And as we saw from Katrina and other storms, evacuation is so important. And I think about this as it relates to my friends in the West and family in San Diego and LA and other places as well, because the evacuation, working or not working, can actually cost or save lives. And one of the lessons that New Orleans took from Katrina was that we needed to make sure that people had safe ways and affordable ways to evacuate, because so many people stayed behind. And of course, over 1,800 people perished in Katrina because they did stay behind. And some of them stayed behind because they did not have access to transportation. Some of them stayed behind because the evacuation the year before from Hurricane Ivan was actually quite bad. There was contraflow that didn't really work very well. And so people were affected by that, as I'll say more about in a minute. And so a lot of people the next year decided that it was maybe safer to stay home. Of course, it was the end of the month. A lot of people, including some of the single parent households, often headed by women who don't make as much as men to the dollar, were not able to afford a hotel to get away to. So for a lot of reasons, people stayed behind. You also couldn't, until a law changed, take your pets with you. And since pets, for a lot of us, are family members, that also discouraged people from leaving. So based on that learning, the city worked with this great NGO, Evacuators, to set up these art installations around the city, which double as places that people know that they can safely hitch a ride out of town before the storm hits. And they actually make provisions so that people can take their pets safely, and the pets can also be safe and evacuate as well. And again, this is really so important because we saw in New Orleans that people stayed behind for all of these reasons and in many cases died. The next slide is actually a picture of my dad. It's a little blurry because it's one of the few pictures that survived Katrina in my mom's home and my sister's home after that storm. And my dad actually passed away in the evacuation from Hurricane Ivan the year before, in 2004. We thought that Hurricane Ivan was actually going to be the big one. It was a massive storm, even bigger than the one that just hit New Orleans. And the people started to evacuate, even though it wasn't mandatory that year. And the contraflow, for those of you who work on these issues, can really be, life or death, not just for people stuck in it that year, but for what people internalize about the safety of getting out in advance of a storm. And so my dad was turned away from a hospital for what was, we thought, a routine heart check, and went to evacuate and never made it back from the evacuation back home, went to the hospital instead, where he died, even though Ivan ended up hitting Mobile, Alabama, and not New Orleans. And so I say this especially to an audience of students who work on transportation, because your work really is so important, and it can really save lives to try to make sure that people can safely evacuate, whether you're talking about evacuation in advance of a hurricane, where we generally have more notice, thank goodness, or a fire where obviously people have very little notice, as you're seeing in California and in Washington State and beyond. Next slide. So, so that people don't have to learn these hard lessons in every single community. From the very beginning of our Climate Center, we created an Adaptation Clearinghouse that's very comprehensive now, with thousands and thousands of resources that are really meant for people on the ground to learn from each other, so that people, again, don't have to learn these hard lessons. They can also learn from toolkits that we have made virtual, like a green infrastructure toolkit or urban heat toolkit or an equitable adaptation toolkit, how you can actually walk through the steps to put in more green infrastructure that actually helps some of these communities avoid some of the dangerous flooding. You see the states and the local governments that have adaptation plans on the books. So I urge you to check that out and to consider it a resource. It's free and it's available for all of you. Next slide. We have a deeper dive on the transportation sector, again, thanks to the last administration. I think some of this might have been taken down since then from the federal sites, but it's still on our website, which is one advantage of doing research outside the federal government these days. So please check out the hundreds of case studies that our team worked really hard to get up on what people are doing to change their transportation sector investments with climate change in mind. Next slide. Okay, so I want to end on a more federal perspective, because we had the pleasure of working with Austin Brown and Darren Sperling and Lou Fulton from your neck of the woods and other colleagues, as you can see here, on a zero carbon action plan that was released earlier this week with much fanfare, and a specific transportation focused event happened yesterday. Hopefully some of you guys participated. We'll be getting up the video soon if it's not up already. The next slide captures a lot of the take-home policy recommendations, but there's a lot more information there, and certainly invite Austin to join the conversation about any of these that you're interested in. These were some of the highlights. The whole idea behind this project was, how do we get to net zero carbon by 2050? It's really challenging, especially given where we are on policy, which is not nearly where we should be. But we believe that we can get there from here in the transportation sector. with some combination of these and other policies, and you see the importance of electrification of vehicles jumping out from these policies, and tackling the VMT, the vehicle miles traveled, as well, through making it safer to have alternatives to single occupancy vehicles, whether that's investing in transit that's affordable and accessible and safe in this COVID era and beyond, bike paths, walking paths, having people located more close to the amenities that they need, all of that. And I will say, even what we're using right now, communicating from a distance, I think we're learning that there's a lot that we can do that doesn't really require us to drive anywhere. And hopefully some of the lessons from this COVID era will continue even beyond. And for those that work on climate, we'll be able to justify meeting virtually, although it's nice to meet in person, meeting virtually at least occasionally and trying to cut back on some of those emissions through broadband and investment in broadband, for example. Next slide. And so in closing, I just want to say, especially to the students, but really to everyone who's joined us today, that it's really up to us to bring this future about. And we have a lot of work to do. Obviously, a lot of us are looking forward with some trepidation to the election next week, because I think that's going to be really critical when you're talking about climate change policies. Such a stark contrast there. But there is so much that we can do in our own communities regardless of that. Engaging in the kind of dialogue that we're having around our Transportation and Climate Initiative, or that California Air Resources Board has. I've been to some of those public meetings, and those are great to engage in as well. Next slide. Or you can just click through, and some other pictures will come up now as you just click through. Tree planting programs, joining a local planning or forestry commission. I volunteered my husband, who has a forestry background, for the Arlington, Virginia Forestry Commission. So he's now working on saving trees. If you can, when you do purchase a vehicle, get a hybrid or a plug-in hybrid or an electric vehicle like the Chevy Bolt that we found to be affordable with the incentives that are offered. And as those prices come down even more, the life cycle cost already are really on par with a internal combustion engine vehicle. So many ways that you can really engage both in your career directly and as a citizen, and I really hope that you'll do that. And the next slide is the last slide, and it's just a list of some of the resources that I mentioned, and I hope that you can go at your leisure and poke around some of the websites and give us any feedback. And with that, I'm happy to turn over to Austin and answer any questions.
Great, thank you, Vicki. Really appreciate that detailed tour through the world of our climate future, and it inspires me to get back to work at all of these things that we need to get done. It feels some days like there's just too much, and then I remember the urgency, and that it is in fact up to us, and then I get back into my desk. So thank you. I have a couple of questions to start us off, and I've seen a few great ones start to come in the chat. So please do use the chat, the Q&A feature. We have quite a bit of time to get into some of these great questions, and we always, as ever, want to address the questions that are of interest to you, the students and the researchers and members of the research community. So related to that, I always like to think about how these seminars relate to what we do as researchers in the research community. So Vicki, while we're getting other questions in from the attendees, can I ask you how transportation research broadly, not necessarily specific to UC Davis, has helped inform your work? Where have there been things that you couldn't have done on the policy implementation, for example, in the TCI, without some research findings? Where has that been useful?
Wow, I mean, it's really been useful everywhere. I mean, it's been useful certainly in my work at the Transportation Research Board. And, as we've tried to understand, for example, the impact of COVID on the economy. I also contributed to a report that was congressionally mandated on the future of the interstate highway system. And so understanding what the trends are and what the costs are, and what people's appetite might be for different kinds of policy approaches, and what approaches moves the needle on both how people use the transportation sector and what that might mean for emissions, translating that. TCI examples include work with the Rochester Institute of Technology, as I mentioned, looking at the freight flows through the region, and then trying to then figure out what that means for the carbon content and whether or not you really have alternatives like short sea shipping, which is hard to say, quickly at least, that might actually reduce some of the carbon emissions and get some of that freight off the roads. Sustainable communities, we work with Bob Nolan, who's really expert in those kind of VMT strategies that we talked about in that project. And they've been great partners to us over the years on sustainable community strategies that the cities and states in the region and MPOs might undertake. So I really can't think of an area that we haven't been informed by research. And the states rely on research very heavily. As you can imagine, if you're a governor and elected and you have to represent the public, it's going to really be important before you make choices about policies that you want to endorse to understand what the implications of those policies might be. What is the overall cost? What is the overall benefit from a climate perspective, but in other ways as well? Are there alternatives that you should be looking at? All those things really have to be informed by analysis for people to really feel comfortable making the decisions that they make. And so I'm really grateful for the researchers, whether it be on the engineering front, and of course that plays such a role when it comes to adaptation in particular. The researchers that are trying to figure out how to invest differently in transportation so that the communities will be more resilient, and you're not putting people back in harm's way. And you're not just throwing good money after bad when you're rebuilding after these disasters, which we're seeing more frequently.
Great. So that's also my way to plug, like, look, your research can make a difference, right? So we sometimes feel like we do this work and it sort of goes into a big void, but it can really be picked up and be turned into practice. So maybe as a follow-up to that, what do you see as like the big open question or questions that we still don't really know the answer to from a research perspective, and that you think it'll be important for us, the research community, to address over the next coming years?
Yeah, I'm more of a policy person, and I see that, I've been working on this for 30 years, guys. I'm getting a little old, but I'm thinking that we got a lot of fundamental questions that should provide enough information for policymakers to make decisions about moving forward. And sometimes it's not, the lack of research that is holding them back. So there's that, right? Because at some point you just have to, make your best guess like you do in any other place in our society, right? Military, risk or insurance risk or any other aspect of our society where you're dealing with an uncertain future. You got to just try to take your best shot, and you can always revisit and revamp your policy. And of course, California is a great example of that, because those policies have been revisited over the years and you tweak it. Dan Sperling, of course, being on the California Air Resources Board, knows this. You tweak it and you make it better, and other people learn from you, and you can reach scale that way. But I think as a non-technology, wonk, it seems to me that we still need to do more when it comes to battery technology and advances in battery technology and understanding what's possible there, and the nexus between that and renewable energy. We saw this coming in some of the questions yesterday, because we were focused, as we are in transportation climate initiative as well, in reducing emissions from the transportation sector. But obviously, if a lot of that is through electrification, it's going to put more pressure on electrification. You're actually going to see the electric sector emissions go up unless you're also tackling the emissions from that sector. So that has to deal with the intermittency of renewables and battery storage, looking at hydrogen, looking at how hydrogen is made so that it's not made with fossil fuels and can, maybe hold that renewable energy in the future that's generated when we have excess renewable energy. So some of those kinds of breakthrough technology areas, I think, are of very much interest. And I think, again, on the adaptation side, improvements in materials and trying to make those improvements make their way into schools and into manuals that allow the states to build safely, because a lot of times there's a real conservatism that people don't want to change what they've been doing unless, of course, those standards bodies sign off on that. So I think having educational institutions really lead the way and train the next generation differently so that there's more acceptance of changes in practices, and then that we actually carry that through people being willing to serve in these boards that actually set standards, or boards like the Transportation Research Board, or get involved with AASHTO, so the Green Book reflects those changes. That's really key.
Great. So I'm going to turn now to some of the questions that have been coming in from the chat and from the Q&A. So keep them coming. So first up is, based on your research and 2017 report, can you tell us how regulatory considerations for utility investment in EV charging infrastructure are different and similar among states? how do state utility commissions usually prioritize values that matters to each state and communities? I think this is a really great question.
It's a great
really
question.
Hard.
Austin can help answer that, because I have to say, I know we've done reports on that, and I wish Matthew Getz was here because he could tell you about that, because he is really engaged a lot with the states and also through networks of people who are doing this in other regions as well, and having these real conversations with the electric utilities, with their state counterparts in the West, in the Midwest, in Rev West, which is more like the Mountain West. But I'm not that person. So I would urge you to check out our website, the TCI website and the Georgetown Climate Center website for some of those reports on those topics, including about the utilities. And maybe, I'll pitch it to your professor because I think, Austin, you've got some experience in that area, right?
A little bit. I mean, I think the questioner here really is showing some understanding with the question, right? That this is something that's worked out largely at the state level, where there's different rules for, can a utility build EV chargers? And utilities would love to do it, right, in most cases, because they would be selling more electricity. But we can't just say, give them a blank check to go build all of this infrastructure. So this is something that's being worked out. California certainly doesn't have it figured out. It's being figured out now, where we're trying several different approaches to how you do this and how utilities should be involved. So I think it's an active topic and something where we really need to have a better understanding.
One area that I've seen the utilities be involved in a really constructive way is bus electrification, because clearly there you really need it. Like, I drive a Bolt, and I don't even have a fast charging plug for. I mean, I have the plug for it, but we didn't get like the 240 volt. I just plug it in at home in the normal outlet, because I don't really drive very far, very often in it these days. But you can certainly get those kinds of, chargers if you live in a single occupancy dwelling pretty easily. Our questions have gone more to what do you do in like multi-unit dwellings, and make sure that public charging is available and things like that. And so those aren't insurmountable barriers, because, like, let's face it, there's electricity everywhere, right? But I will say where it's really been important, I think, is like DC government bought, I think, 12 circulator buses at one time, and those are very large, and it's great that they're clean. And they're really cheap. For a while, they were even free. I think they're like $1. You could ride all over DC in them. And so there are these great big electric buses. But of course, that could put a big load on the system. And so there, it was really important for them to work very closely with the utility on where they were going to charge and when they were going to charge. And out here in Virginia, it's actually been a nice partnership with Dominion and the state to get a lot of electric school buses online that are able to actually be backup power and shave off the peaks, especially in the summer when the kids aren't in school, and you might have a specifically, an exceptionally hot day, and those buses might not be used, because it's summer or because it's the middle of the day when they're not picking up kids or dropping off kids. And so you can shave the peaks off with that battery power. So, I mean, I think that's a particular place where the collaboration with the utilities is really an important opportunity. But I will say, I think more broadly, it seems like there's this model where other folks are in on the action, right? I mean, other EV charging infrastructure companies, right? There's more competition.
Yeah, those are great points. So changing topics a little bit. So the next question that came in was, are there potential boundary issues with the TCI program? If so, how does it address them? Or does it basically rely on the mega region boundary of the Northeast to mitigate most potential issues? Are there obvious ways to address boundary challenges in transportation related cap and trade programs? I think this is something that California has also had to think about and maybe doesn't have totally figured out.
Yeah, I mean, this is the downside of not having, a comprehensive federal policy, right? And I'm not saying that a federal policy could do everything that TCI is doing. And we actually did start TCI even when there were, more positive vibes coming, let's say, from the federal government, because all the legs of the stool, as you know, there's the car standards, which, as we've seen, are set by the California leadership or the federal level or both. There's the fuels, which again, California is leading on, but generally, has been more at the federal level, or, some ethanol incentives and things like that at the state level. And then there's the VMT, which is especially important for the state planning level and the local land use. So you really do need investment and people to be rowing in the same direction when it comes to these reductions at all those different levels. Having said that, there certainly may be, leakage concerns from any regional program that doesn't have, the coverage of every single person that might come and go from a region. It's a benefit of doing this regionally as opposed to state by state. And I think it's why we're starting to see, along with the fact that climate impacts are driving some of the companies to be more progressive, frankly. But I think it's why we're starting to see more support for TCI than we've seen in the past from carbon pricing or cap and trade or cap and invest or other policies that have been tried, for example, in Washington State, where the industry was pretty uniformly against it. I think because it is a regional approach, there is more of a sense that it's not like a complete patchwork. But any of these cap and invest kind of policies, whether it be RGGI or a transportation program, could have some leakage. For example, if somebody goes outside of the region to get their gas. Now, obviously, if the price signal is not going to be all that dramatic, and the modeling has shown that it's nowhere near the normal fluctuations in gas prices, I don't think it's very likely that people are going to go to a different jurisdiction, certainly if it's not right there close by, to buy their gasoline somewhere else. And so because of the nature of the program being like that kind of upstream price signal, but then the emissions reduction benefits and the investment benefits flow to the states that are actually participating in the program, I don't necessarily think that we'll see a lot of it, but obviously a bigger region is better in terms of coverage and in terms of the emission reduction benefits.
Yeah, that's a great point about the regions. I think those of us who grew up in California often forget that people may live in one state and commute to another state in the Northeast, right, which is a little less common in California. But there you might have issues. But if all of those states are participating, people are unlikely to move out of the region simply because of something like this. It does, though, remind me a little bit of when I was in Washington, D.C., and they put in a gas 5-cent bag tax, and you saw social media explode with people who claimed they were going to drive out of the district to go shopping, which seems like much more than 5 cents worth of your time and gasoline to go do so, right? But people sometimes have irrational responses to these things.
Yeah, and like that's an example of yet another policy that actually I think had win-wins. I did a TED Talk several years ago, and I mentioned the DC bag tax because actually they used the 5 cents from that to not only dissuade people and just bring your own bags, right? Bring your own canvas bags or whatever. From all that plastic. The plastic then didn't end up in the Anacostia River and foul the river, but also they used the proceeds to invest in green and cool roofs. So it really did create some real virtuous cycles, both cutting down on the pollution, but also providing an investment, including for homeowners who wanted to invest in green roofs, which actually bring a benefit not just to them, but to the neighborhood in terms of like urban heat island effect and absorbing rainwater and things like that. So that's actually a pretty cool program. But I mean, it's never popular to charge people fees or taxes or whatever you want to call them, right?
Right. And then, but I mean, the river is a lot cleaner, right? So at the
Yeah.
end of the day, some progress has been made. Okay, so one other question that's come through. So it says, the questioner says, thank you for including active transportation. Has the Georgetown Climate Center or TCI done a public health cost benefit analysis because of the compound benefits of improved public health and climate improvement? And maybe I can take a little bit more broadly because you mentioned contributions to public health and also that you're doing these analyses of the costs and benefits. How, I guess, in general, should we try to include these sticky questions of the sort of health benefits that we might see from these transportation investments?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, our Cambridge systematics analysis and also the Harvard analysis more recently showed that those active transportation health benefits are actually substantial. I mean, I actually think they drive a lot of the benefit numbers, even more so than the air pollution, although obviously the distributional effects of air pollution are really important. And one concern about the active transportation benefits is that those often will accrue to people who might be more affluent, generally more white, maybe in neighborhoods that it's safer to have that infrastructure, or they've just been favored by their policymakers, right? And they've got that bike path that's safe, infrastructure and walkability and things like that. And a lot of people have been driven far away from their work by the housing costs in a place like here. So I would say if you're interested in that, take a look at our analysis that we shared before the MOU came out last time, and the analysis that was shared on the September calls, and the Harvard analysis, which was shared after our September 29th equity-focused webinar by the Harvard Trek team in particular for more detailed analysis, and you can sort of see what's driving those benefits. And it's unfortunate that we didn't already know that the states really wanted to do this kind of concentrated 35%, hundreds of millions of dollars potentially, investment throughout the region for the benefit of those communities that need it most, because, that would, I think, move the needle even further if you add that. And I think, another interesting thing from a research perspective is adding like what we're seeing in terms of the benefits or the cost of COVID, right? I mean, the benefits of tackling emissions because of COVID, I should say. So, that's a whole new wrinkle that we're seeing, that it's not just the direct benefit from people not getting sick from air pollution if they have asthma or cardiopulmonary disease. Kids and old people are very susceptible to these things in general. But then we're seeing people, certain classes of our citizens that are disproportionately impacted by COVID. I didn't really think we've probably been able to capture that because it's all so new. But I think that would also, weigh even more heavily on the benefit side from these kinds of investments that both get people out of vehicles so that there's neighborhood benefits for all, but that the people themselves who are exercising more realize those benefits directly.
Great. Yeah, and that's an area where I think we're seeing all the new research makes it look like the health benefits are bigger and bigger than we'd ever thought, right? And so both from the pollution side and from these other secondary effects. So that's an area where it's been really important. When people sometimes, I think, are hesitant to want to put a monetary value on human health and welfare, and I understand that. But what we've basically done in the past is, if we can't value it, we've treated it as if it's zero value, right? And so you need to have that in order to be able to go in and say, look, we're investing money to improve those outcomes. Really glad that you've been.
Right. And there's so much quality of life benefit too. Just think about like in Arlington, Virginia, we've actually been able to grow the economy dramatically, but keep the traffic down and keep the greenhouse gas emissions down because of things like the metro and because of great safe bike paths. And my husband's a cyclist, and so he cycled to work into the district for many, many years. And in fact, he didn't want to move closer in to the district when we got married because it would shorten his bike commute and he wouldn't get his miles in. So I mean, it's just such a luxury to have a safe way to get to work that also gets you the exercise that you rely on. And it really can be done. It can really bring some net benefits, as we've seen in Arlington.
Yeah, I love the Arlington example. When I was in DC, I used to get to do a lot of work in partnership with the TDM program there. They have the really world-leading, or at least nation-leading, transportation demand management program that helps make sure there's those alternative commute options, and really have drawn a lot of inspiration from there. I think living in the DC area and then in Davis, I've been maybe in the two ends of how you can do bicycling and active infrastructure, very different urban forms in a lot of ways, but also some similar successes. And
also moving from parking minimums to parking maximums, really try to drive people to not drive. Yeah.
Have any of the states looked at, I know those aren't set at the state levels, but have the states dared say anything about pricing parking or not building as much parking?
I think in terms of like the sharing best practices work that's come up, but I don't, like TCI operates at that, kind of meta level on the MOU. So we're certainly not into the weeds, but, that would be the kind of thing that states with their stakeholders as part of that process that we lay out, if that's the kind of thing that gets traction, I think that would be good. I mean, we've seen that it works in Arlington, and to my knowledge, people aren't complaining about that.
So the next question is a little bit more on sort of interactions with the international community. So how do you see emerging economies adopting TCI research that you've helped conceptualize here in the US? If there's a gap in the policy or academic research in emerging big economies such as India and China, how do you see the role of US academic centers and researchers in fostering collaboration to attain common objectives and global outcomes? So you mentioned earlier, China setting some new rules. Like how do these factors interact? How does the learning we're doing in the TCI region and in California help influence global policy making?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. We're really more focused at the state and national level, but we do take leaders from the states. We've had the honor of bringing Mary Nichols and working with governors to come, and other state leaders, including from TCI, to the climate negotiations over the years since 2009 in Copenhagen, all the way through Paris and since. And while we don't really play a role in the negotiations per se, I think it's been important to share at either official UN side events or events on the US stage, or other we're still in kind of events since the Trump administration really pulled out, with the global community about what the states are doing and about what the regions are doing. Because we're not doing this research sort of for the sake of research and publishing it. That might be different from like a research group like Harvard that I think is, certainly going to pursue published peer-reviewed, literature for their analysis, but that's not our role at Georgetown. So, the information is up there. It's often in white papers and things like that, that we do or the consultants do. So it's not like something we're, actively talking about with scholars in other parts of the world. But I will say this, I think that because information can be shared in real time now, people know, people in the EU, Damian Meadows, for example, who's worked on the EU ETS for years. I mean, somebody like that who pays attention knows what California is doing at all times. And I would dare say probably even knows what TCI is doing now that as of the summer I'm on Twitter. So I think, you can't underestimate the ability to move people by just sharing, it's not necessarily best practices, but it's just like what people are working out, right? And we're all learning by doing. This is just such a complex issue, and it's obviously going to take all of us moving at a rate of change that is not necessarily easy for political systems. So I think that's why platforms like what we put out there in the adaptation world to try to share those practices hopefully can be picked up by people all over the world. And I would point especially to that for an example of where I think global people can take, no matter where your country is, if you're experiencing fires or floods, you could take some of that policy work that's about US government or sub-government changes and apply it to your own legal and policy system, and probably, really be able to get a long way to meeting the challenge locally, because a lot of those are the same kind of challenges that you're dealing with in your different governance system. And similarly, I think with mitigation, people can learn good and bad lessons from the process and the substance of things like the California program and TCI. I will say that people often invoke California in the conversations around equity. Some people, don't think that the California system has addressed all of those concerns. Some analysis and research lately has shown that it actually has benefited low-income communities and communities of color the most, in part because of the investment priorities. So there are all these researchers that are doing this work, and I will tell you that we in the States are really looking at that hard and crafting the best policy we can craft here. I'm sure it's not going to be perfect, but we'd be happy to speak to anybody who's trying to do the same thing and share our lessons, because it's in all of our interest to do as much of this together as we can. No one country or region or state can do this alone.
Great. Well, we're getting right to the end of the hour, so maybe I'll just ask a big picture question at the end to let you wrap it up. You've mentioned just a huge variety of great policy options that states are considering that we should be thinking about. You've also told us, how very far we need to go with this difference between where our current policy is and where we need to get to. What are you most excited about in terms of potential policy developments over the next year or two? What are the big things that we need to go out and try to accomplish? I know we have hundreds of things that need to be done, but if it was just restricting it to the really big pivot point policy movers, what should we be focusing on right now?
Yeah, well, obviously, this next election is going to be so important. And I think that already there are some interesting options for the new Congress as well as the new president that have been teed up. Things like a clean energy standard, which I think could really get some traction to move clean energy investments, and not so much just in the transportation sector. This tends to be in the electric sector, but it's obviously really important that we get the emissions down in that sector for transportation as we electrify. So that's one opportunity that I'm really watching very closely. Also, and I should say that several opportunities, because there's actually several bills that are pending on the clean energy standard. So I think in all the bad news, people don't know that people are really still trying to move legislation, and it won't happen this year, but it could be taken up next year. And in the transportation sector, I think there's been a lot of interesting work done around infrastructure investments and stimulus in particular. And we could very well see, especially with COVID raging still, unfortunately, you know, a real effort to put in a transportation infrastructure bill, which we need to renew anyway, but also with stimulus that would really jumpstart some of these innovations in electric vehicle charging infrastructure and corridors and improvements in accessibility of this technology, trying to really move the needle. So those are two things that I'm watching in the short term, and I'm really hoping that that gets unleashed, along with a lot of other good stuff after next week.
Great. Well, as ever, I appreciate seeing what's up for you, and congratulations on all the success so far. And we're all pulling for the TCI to get over the finish line. It's, I think, an incredibly important collaboration that's already produced a huge amount of great learning for all the rest of us as well. So unless you have any final thoughts to share with the group, I'll just say thank you very much for joining us today.
I'd love to see any people on their way out, and we could just wave to each other.
Yes.
I hope everybody's enjoyed it, and I hope to get to meet you all in person soon, but maybe we could just wave to each other, and I can wish everybody a happy Halloween and a wonderful weekend.
Thank you for reminding me of that, Vicki. I know having taught a couple of classes online now, I know it's a totally different thing when you're only looking at blank screens to be able to give such an engaging presentation. So thanks so much.
No, that's okay. I feel people after the end of a long week of Zoom, so I completely get you. It's completely optional, but I just thought I'd say hi. Look forward to meeting you guys in person someday.
Thanks, Vicki.
Thank you, Vicki.
Thank
Have
you.
a good weekend.
Too.
Thank you.
Thank you.